Fixing your knitting mistakes is an important part of the process for every single knitter. You want to fix your mistakes, but you can recognize them, but you have no idea how to fix them or even how you made the mistake in the first place. So you end up tinking back or ripping out your whole project just to fix a mistake. There is a better way, but it all starts with one simple thing: learning how to read your knitting. Once you understand how knitted fabric is created and how your stitches work together, the process of fixing mistakes becomes so much easier. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I know it seems pretty basic, but really understanding how knitted fabric works is the first step in being able to fix your mistakes. You can't fix mistakes if you can't read your knitting. So let's go to the overhead and get right to it. Now, knitting is really just simply loops that are joined together to create your knitted fabric. You work a row of loops, you turn your work, or you're knitting in the round, and you work another row or round of loops, and all you're doing is bringing some yarn through to create a new loop into the old loop. But it really all starts with one loop, and one loop looks just like this. There's one stitch, and it has three parts. If you want to talk about like the anatomy of a stitch, it has a head, what we refer to as the head of the stitch, that top part. And then it has two legs, a right leg and a left leg. And those are the legs that we talk about when we're talking about how to knit into a stitch. It's generally between those two legs. So that's the basic part of a stitch. It has a head and it has two legs, a right leg and a left leg. Now this right leg is often referred to as the leading leg because it's usually the leg that you're working into, that you're looking for when you're making a new stitch, and it also leads to the stitch before it. And you can see that in our large swatch right here. Here's a stitch right here. We can see the head is right there, and we have the two legs, the right and the left leg. This is an open stitch. They're not twisted or crossed. Each leg is leading off to the stitch to either side. This left leg is joined right there to the stitch next to it. And this right leg, our leading leg, is joined to that stitch on that side. So you have this row of loops. They're all connected with this strand that's in between each of our stitches. Now, if we wanted to make another knit stitch, we would take our needle, and it would come through the front of this stitch, and we would grab our yarn and pull it through, and that would create a new knit stitch. Now, if we wanted to create a purl stitch, we wouldn't come from the front into that stitch. We would come from behind, still right there between the two legs, behind, taking our yarn from the front this time and pulling it through, and that gives us a purl stitch. Now it does nothing for the stitch we've just created. What it does is finish that open loop that was on our needles. As we can see right here, this stitch looks a little bit different. All the other stitches, we can see all of the legs of the stitches, they form these V's. But right here, this stitch instead, we can see the legs, but they're kind of hiding behind this new stitch. And what's really prominent here is the head of the stitch. So when you're looking at your knits and your purls, that's really what you're looking at. If you're looking at a knit stitch, you're looking for the two legs, the right and the left leg. They have been closed up by the stitch that's underneath after they've been worked. And the new stitch covers the head of the stitch. So all you see are the two legs. You don't see the head of the stitch. That's behind that new stitch that's on your needles right now. So for a knit stitch, you're seeing those two legs and they end up in the shape of a V. But they really are, if you pull them apart, you can see they're separate. There's the head of the stitch underneath. But when you're seeing a knit stitch, you're seeing a V. But when you're seeing a purl stitch, you're not really seeing that V. You're seeing the head of the stitch right here. Now the legs could be exposed a little bit under that new stitch, but the head is very prominent, and it's not prominent in a knit stitch. But really, a knit and a purl are just, they're two sides of the same coin. If you think of a coin, it has two different sides. One stitch is the same. It has a knit side and a purl side. If we flip this over and look at that, we've got a knit stitch right here. So it's a knit on one side, it's a purl on the other. It's the same stitch, it's just two sides of that stitch. Now where things get interesting is when we start introducing how those stitches sit on the needle. Now here in North America, in Europe, in Western countries, you'll generally see your stitches sitting so that right leg is on the front of your needle. Your stitches should be sitting like this. This is called a Western stitch mount. We think about that stitch again with its head and its two legs. That right leg sits on the front of the needle and the left leg is sitting on the back. This is referred to as a Western stitch mount. This is what you'll commonly see in North America and in Europe. Now, the Eastern stitch mount is the reverse of this. That right leading leg sits at the back. It's still the same open loop, but now it's mounted differently on the needle. That right leg is now sitting towards the back and the left leg is in the front. This is referred to as the Eastern stitch mount. And sometimes you could even have combinations. You could have some that are Eastern mounted and then some that are Western mounted. You can combine both in the same fabric, but no matter what, you're paying attention to where those legs of the stitches are, and you're using those to decide how you should work the fabric. So let's go back to our Western stitch mount where that right leg is in the front. And if we're going to knit a stitch when it's sitting on the needle like this, we come in to the front between the two legs. We take our yarn from behind and we pull it through to create a new stitch. Now, if those stitches are sitting so that right leg is in the back, nothing actually changes. We're still looking for that right leg. And we're using that, in this case, what the term we would use is knitting through the back leg. It's technically still the right leg, but because it's sitting on the back of the needle, we call it knitting through the back leg. So we're looking for that right leading leg. We insert from there and we bring our yarn through to create a new stitch. And either method will give you a knit stitch. When you see a stitch like this, you can't tell whether that was mounted Eastern or Western. It still creates a knit stitch. Now let's go back to that Western stitch mount and look at purling again. So we've got our stitches with the right leg sitting on the front, and we know that a purl is the opposite of a knit. So instead of coming from the front to grab our yarn, we come from behind. We've reversed things. The yarn's in the front, the needle's behind, and we pull our working yarn through, and that creates that purl stitch. So if our stitches are sitting in the Eastern stitch mount, that right leg is in the back, we're still looking for that right leg to purl our stitch. So our yarn's in the front, we're not coming from the front this time, we're coming from behind still, looking for our right leading leg. They would refer to this as purling through the back loop or the back leg because it's on the back of the needle, but it's still the right leading leg. We bring our yarn through to create a purl stitch. So I hope you're understanding here, no matter how the stitch sits on your needle, in the end you're going to create a knit or a purl, and you can't actually tell which way they were sitting on the needle to begin with. But it comes down to this stitch, whether it's sitting with the right leg in the front or in the back, you're still using that leg to tell you where to work this stitch. This leading leg, whether it's sitting Western mounted or Eastern mounted, is giving you the direction of where your yarn and your needle needs to come through to create a new stitch. You're still, no matter where it's sitting, coming through both legs to draw your new yarn through to create the new stitch. So when you're looking at your knitting, pay attention to how your stitches are seated. Neither one is correct or the other one's not wrong. They're both correct. And you can create a knit stitch and a purl stitch with both of these stitches. It doesn't matter how it's mounted, but you do want to pay attention to how it's mounted, because if you're not paying attention, that's when you end up with twisted stitches, which we'll get to in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about how we actually get these stitches like this on the needle. How do you end up with a Western mounted stitch? How do you end up with an Eastern mounted stitch? It all comes down to how you wrap the yarn around your needle to begin with. So let's go back to our Western mounted stitch. Right leg is on the front of the needle. So when we bring our yarn through, we have two choices. We can wrap it so it is wrapped from left to right or counterclockwise, or we can wrap it clockwise or right to left. And how you wrap the yarn around the needle is how you end up with an Eastern or a Western mounted stitch. So if I want to mount my stitch like they are here, I want that right leg in the front. It comes down to how I wrap the yarn around the needle. Think of the tip of the needle as a clock. And if you want to wrap it in the standard Western stitch mount, you're going to wrap it counterclockwise or from left to right. You're going to start over here and come around this way. You're not going in the direction of a clock. You're going opposite of what, like the clock. The second hand on a clock would be going this way. We want to come this way. So from left to right around our needle. And it's seated just like the stitch underneath had been. The right leg is in the front. So it all comes down to that simple motion of which direction you're going to wrap the yarn. So my stitches on my needle are still mounted in the Western style, but what if I wanted to wrap it in an Eastern method? I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to wrap it in the opposite direction. For a regular Western mounted stitch, we go counterclockwise or from left to right. Now, if we want an Eastern mounted stitch, we're going to go in the opposite direction. We're going to go clockwise. Hold our yarn like we're knitting and we're wrapping it like a clock. We pull it through. And if we look at the stitch mount on this new stitch, that right leg is now in the back. Our stitch underneath looks completely normal. We can't tell looking at that stitch whether that was mounted Eastern or Western. But while it's on the needle, we can see we wrap that yarn clockwise from right to left, and it put that right leg in the back. So that's how you create an Eastern mounted or a Western mounted stitch. It comes down to the way you wrap your yarn around your needles. So as you're knitting, pay attention. How do you wrap the yarn around your needles? How do your stitches end up on the needles? Do they end up in this Western stitch mount, or do they end up in this Eastern stitch mount? And this is where you could end up with a combination. Perhaps your knit stitches end up Eastern mounted and your purl stitches end up Western mounted. It's all in the way you wrap the yarn. So let's look at that purl stitch. So we're back to our Western stitch mount. And we know in this case, the yarn's going to be in the front and we're coming from behind using that leading leg as our guide. So we have our yarn and we're going to do the same exact thing. Western is counterclockwise. Remember, the point of our needle is our clock. Clockwise goes this way. We want to wrap it this way, clockwise, counterclockwise, or bringing it forward, up, and around, and drawing it through. And we have our purl stitch is underneath. The stitch on our needle isn't actually anything yet. We've created a purl stitch by finishing the open loop on our fabric, but now we have a new stitch on our needle. And the right leg is sitting in the front like a Western mounted stitch. But we can also do an Eastern mounted stitch here, even though this stitch is mounted Western. It's all in how you wrap the yarn. So if your stitch is sitting like this and you're going to purl, think of a point of a clock again. We went counterclockwise. Now this time we're going to come clockwise. So we have our yarn and we're going to go between the fabric and the needle, wrap it around and pull it through. And now look at that stitch that's on the needle. Our right leg is back here and our left leg is in the front. We've created a new purl stitch. We finished that open loop that was on our needles and created the final format for that stitch. And we have put a new stitch on the needle, but it's mounted with that right leading leg in behind. So it all comes down to how you wrap the yarn around the needle. Clockwise will give you an eastern stitch mount, counterclockwise will give you a western stitch mount, and that's how they end up like that on your knitting needle. So let's take this a little further and actually talk about the different fabrics you create. Now that you really understand how a stitch is formed, how it becomes a knit stitch or a purl stitch, how your stitches sit on the needle and how they should be worked no matter where it's sitting on that needle. So let's start with a basic stitch pattern, stockinette. We've got this right here. Stockinette is very obvious. It's nice and smooth. It has these columns of V's. Don't look at these upside down V's. Those are actually you're between the stitches. The actual stitch is right here. These two legs that we looked at before in our stitch have been pulled together. The head of the stitch is hidden and all we see are these two legs being pulled together by the head of the stitch underneath. So we just see that V. So you can count your stitches by looking at each of these V's. That is each one is a stitch, and that gives you the stitches in one column right here. So that's how you can read stockinette. And of course, the back side of stockinette is called reverse stockinette because it is just the back side of that stockinette fabric. So while we see all of the legs of the stitches on this side, we see all of the heads of the stitches and also the joining legs between the two stitches. Here's the head of a stitch. It looks like a frown or an umbrella right there. And then these are the leading legs of the stitch above it that come underneath that head and leading off to the stitches over here. So if we wanted to count in reverse stockinette, to make it really simple, I would flip it and just count to the other side. But if I wanted to count this, I would be looking for that column. And I'm not looking at these legs that are going off to the stitches. I am looking for these umbrellas or these frowns. And I would count those as I was going up. If you're ever working tables and you've got reverse stockinette in between, then you would look for the head of the stitch. It's the same, it's just hidden differently than it would be on the other side. We're looking for this part of the stitch. These we don't see the legs because they're on the front. We do see this part of the stitch. That's to either side where those stitches are joined. But this right here is the head of our stitch. If we pull this down, we can see there's the legs of the stitch right there. But that's how you would read reverse stockinette. You would look for the heads of those stitches. This gets a bit more complicated when you introduce other stitch patterns. For example, reverse stockinette is often confused with garter stitch, but they're actually two different fabrics. You can probably maybe tell here that the sizes are very, very different. The first thing to do to tell if you're not sure whether it's garter or reverse stockinette, flip it over. If it looks like stockinette on the other side, then you're looking at reverse stockinette. If it just looks like more garter stitch on the other side, then you're just looking at garter stitch. But this looks like this fabric because we see all of this texture and all the heads of these stitches. Now when you look more closely at this, you will be able to see the difference. You just need to stretch it apart. And you'll see that we actually have rows of purls and rows of knits. Right here, we can see we have a stitch. There's the legs of the stitch. There's the head of the stitch. That's to the front of the work. So it presents as a purl stitch on this side of the fabric. But then right above that, we can see we've got a stockinette stitch right there, or a knit stitch. We can see the legs of the stitch. We can't see the head of the stitch because it's in behind the legs of this stitch above it. You can't do that with reverse stockinette. I can pull it apart, but it's all purl stitches on this side of the work. I don't see any of those knit stitches. But when you can pull it apart and you can see in between that you've got these rows of knits between those rows of purl stitches, then you're looking at garter stitch. Then you can take those two stitches, our two sides of the coin, our knit stitch and our purl stitch, and stack them up on top of each other. If we stack some knits and stack some purls, then we can get ribbing. This is 2 by 2 ribbing. You could do 1 by 1 ribbing or anything like that. So you would set your pattern with your knits and your purls, and then you would pay attention to them as they're on your needle. And when they're sitting on your needle, you're looking at the stitches underneath. Right there is a knit stitch. We know what that looks like now, a little V. So this would be the reverse. We're seeing the head of that stitch right underneath. We're not seeing the legs of the stitch. So we know these are purl stitches, and we've got more knit stitches, more purl stitches. Then we can even change this again and break up that rib pattern by alternating knits and purls. Now this one just looks like lots of texture, so we can pull it apart to look, and it's very similar to garter stitch. We have alternating between our knit stitches right here. You can see the legs of the stitch, but you can't see the head. But then we go above it, we can see the legs of this stitch, but we also see the head of this stitch. But it's just alternating on every stitch now instead of every row like garter stitch. So we're taking our two basic stitches and creating lots of different fabrics. And we should discuss twisted stitches while we're here. I don't have a swatch of that, but we will talk about how they are formed, and that usually happens because you're not sure how your stitch is sitting on your needle. What happens with a twisted stitch is as you work it, you end up twisting it closed. And you can see right away, it doesn't look like the stitches underneath. That right leg has moved in front of the left leg and it's crossing off to the left. A normal stitch, those legs don't cross. There's our right leg, there's our left leg. They are open and leading off in two different directions. But if I came down and I crossed this stitch when I worked it, look at that leg right there. That obviously looks different. You can tell that right leg is going in this direction instead of staying open like the stitches to either side. Now this happens because you're not paying attention to how your stitches are sitting on your needle when you're knitting them. So if they're sitting in this direction and you decide to treat it like you were knitting through the back leg, and you knit back here and you pulled that stitch through, you pulled your new stitch through, you have twisted your stitch. But you can do the same if it is an Eastern stitch mount, if that right leading leg's in behind and you don't notice this and you always knit through the front leg that's sitting on the front of the needle. This is most commonly what happens, is somehow your stitches end up on your needle in the Eastern stitch mount, but you treat them like they're still seated like a Western mounted stitch. So you come into the front leg, but notice this time that front leg is the left leg, it's not the right leg. You grab your yarn and you pull that through, and you've created a crossed or twisted stitch. The left leg is now leading off into this direction and the right leg is leading off into that direction instead of leaving it open like it should be. So this commonly happens because your stitches are mounted. Usually what happens in North America is you are used to knitting through the front leg, but your stitch is mounted in the Eastern method where that leading leg's in the back, and you still knit it through the front, so you twist the stitch. It can happen this way if you usually mount your stitches the Eastern method, but you happen to have one that is mounted Western and you still knit through the back leg, you can twist it. Now, we generally don't want twisted stitches. We want open fabric with each leg separate and leading to the stitches on either side. But there are cases where you will want to twist those stitches. If you're working an increase, perhaps you're working a make one between the two stitches, you don't want to leave it open, so you will twist it closed to the right or to the left, Or if you've worked a yarn over, you might want to twist that closed. Or there are stitch patterns that require you to work twisted stitches. In those cases, you do want to work a twisted stitch, but in most cases, you want your fabric open with open loops that lead off to the right or the left without twisting them, like this stitch right here. Now that you understand the basics of stitch anatomy and how your stitches work together to create knitted fabric, it's time to take that knowledge a step further and actually fix your mistakes. Now that you recognize what your knitting should look like, if there is a mistake, you can recognize it and you can understand that it needs to be fixed. Then the next step in the process is actually learning how to fix that thing. And I have a whole course devoted to that topic. We start with the very basics, from just tinking back, frogging back, lifelines, all those basic things, all the way to advancing to dropping down and fixing a whole section of lace. Without ripping out your whole project or your swatch, I'm going to demonstrate exactly how to do all of these techniques. You're going to knit and swatch along with me and practice these, so the next time you have a project and you make a mistake, you'll know exactly how to fix it. You'll find the link for the course down below, so click down there, grab your yarn and your needles, and let's fix your knits.